Hey everybody, happy Friday. Welcome to another edition of Friends Friday. We're really excited to have you spending a few minutes with us this morning. Hope you guys are enjoying the Friday and getting ready for a nice weekend. We're really excited to have Caleb Davis on with us today. Caleb, thanks so much for taking some time out of your day. Would love to introduce you. Like, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and let the audience know kind of like who you are, what you're doing, and a little bit about your background. We're really excited to be talking about kind of like the evolution of product security and embedded security, IoT, and how it relates to the world today, and how important it is, and not only from the security testing side, but the threat landscape side. So I'm really excited about the topic, but would love for you to introduce yourself, and then we can dive in. So.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. As Dan mentioned, my name is Caleb Davis, co-founder of SolaSec. My journey into cybersecurity was an interesting one. I have a background in electrical engineering, and thought I was going to be a power systems engineer one day, and then realized that I enjoyed software, and then got the opportunity to do some embedded software development, and that led to having to defend on these low-level IoT devices, and that kind of opened my eyes to the world of offensive security. So, jumped headfirst into that whole world, and really enjoyed using my electrical engineering development background, to apply that to all things related to embedded cybersecurity. And then, from that, did the world of consulting, seeing multiple different industries and types of devices and different vulnerabilities throughout. And now, at SolaSec, and that's my primary focus, is how do we help organizations that are developing products make them more securely, deal with them remotely, and make sure that we have a safer infrastructure supporting us with all these IoT devices.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, and I think your journey sounds very classic hacker oriented, right? You kind of get started in tech in like one area, and then you just in the classic hacker mentality of like figuring out how things work, and then it kind of evolves into security. So that's cool. Like, my experience was very similar, and like we're talking about embedded device security, product security, IoT. My background in penetration testing was being AppSec, and so when working with Veracode and Mayo Clinic and a couple of these other groups, we got some fun projects, and because I had 2 degrees in computer science, and I actually had some experience with reverse engineering, I loved kind of binary analysis, and then like picking up embedded systems code and trying to figure out the gaps. I think one of I joke that like my non-claim to fame was like I actually got to work on a project. This was kind of before the car hacking stuff had actually become very public, but I had gotten to work on a reverse engineering project where we were testing some head units in some vehicles. I can't name who it was, but like some of the things that we found. It was code based. It was hypothetical, right? Eventually did come out publicly, like not, it was completely independent, like of the work we were doing, because obviously we were hired to go find this stuff, but these guys actually found it, on their own. So it is kind of fun to kind of see some of the stuff that we had been exposed to, and like, and actually hypotheticals, because we didn't have any dynamic testing. It was just static testing, right? Mm-hmm. But that kind of stuff where it's like, hey, these, software is getting more and more embedded in our daily lives, as we all know. Internet of Things is as a true thing now. It's not just kind of some hypothetical, and these embedded systems are being used in very critical infrastructure. So it's been interesting. Now that I've kind of been out of testing, I don't have as much exposure, which is why I kind of want to pick your brain on how things are evolving. But back when I was doing testing, it was variant, right? It was you would do some testing on some things that were very locked down and had some good security protocols in place. And then others where it was like, it was easier than a lab device in the OSCP, right? Where it's like, oh, it's running a vulnerable version of Tomcat. You've got an easy exploit you can just go throw on it. And now you've broken into like an insulin pump or something like that, right? So it sounded really sexy and really cool, but at the end of the day, from a hacker's perspective, it was not that. It was very trivial. I'm sure things have evolved, since then. At least I hope so. So I'd love to kind of get your take on, like, how you've seen it evolve, coming at it from that, kind of that, low level aspect.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd say, the unfortunate reality is that it's evolved in the security capabilities and the, the recognition of some of these types of attacks, but it's also evolved in just the threat landscape of these devices. I mean, that's kind of the nature of IoTs, that, everything in your house is connected now. And, you can make a strong argument as to why you need a connected refrigerator or something like that. So, the surface is expanding. So I still see, the easy, OSCP level 1 type boxes when it comes to embedded product. And, a lot of that is related to, the drivers for some of these things are just first to market or the cheapest, or, whatever other externalities that result in, thinking about security as an afterthought. Right. And, that really materializes into some pretty nasty IoT exploits in terms of the network. And then, even more, you got all these devices that have these components that are inherently vulnerable to more of these advanced attack vectors that we'll talk about today. But that's kind of the nature of how things have changed in terms of the landscape. But I don't want to be all doom and gloom, because I think that there have been certain industries, especially industries that are heavily driven by regulation, like medical, for example, or automotive, or some of the industrial control systems to some extent, are pushing more and more for security just because they understand the risk, right? So, the types of attacks where you're running a Windows XP system and you go download some, Metasploit type module, right, and apply it to a system, I think those times are hopefully, few and far between now, depending on who you're working with. So we're getting much lower in the stack, and understanding sort of the foundation of security that we're building things on top of, which is really exciting to see. Just as an example, seeing medical device manufacturers that are using commercial resources or SBCs or something like that, and then validating the security of that platform that they're building on top of, rather than just assuming it at face value is secure, and that's the manufacturer's problem. So, it's, as everything, it's a spectrum of different maturity levels throughout.
Yeah. What have you seen? How have you seen, like, just in terms of as IoT has become much more prevalent, like at the home as well as critical infrastructure? What have you seen as, like, some of the common themes around some of the attacks in the threat landscape as that's continued to evolve?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the most common themes that I would say is that, most of the time, like I talked about, the refrigerator is an innocuous device. I think we've seen several instances where people will just, for whatever reason, not really understand the risk associated with some of these devices. And, if we talk about like a DDoS type attack where, multiple devices are compromised, or, you use one of those devices and it compromises your internal network, or those are used to attack a different, target. That's a big one. But then I think similarly, some of you mentioned the industrial controls and manufacturing facilities and things along those lines. Those networks that are historically not emphasized because of obscurity to some extent, or it's difficult to maintain and operate, things like a manufacturing line. More and more those are not only under more scrutiny, and we've seen some notable incidents related to some of those targets. But I think also, we're understanding that those infrastructure networks, those facilities have a major impact on downstream things, right? So, like, imagine a manufacturing facility where IoT devices are being produced, and then they're being, the firmware is being updated before they get sent out to the field. It never touches a back-end server again. The supply chain risk associated with one of these manufacturing facilities getting compromised and then malicious code just being flashed at a production facility is a incredibly scary thing to think through.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, I think, like, one would hope, or at least, like, if you are in those industries, kind of, making sure that you're keeping these things on your radar in terms of how you're evaluating your threat models, for where attacks could insert. I mean, where attackers could be inserted or where backdoors could be inserted. I think, supply chain is a great example, both in like the software and the firmware, right? I mean, the software and the physical, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And I mean, I think anybody that's probably been in and around the government at any point knows the term like supply chain interdiction, right? And so like these are not new techniques or new things, but becoming much easier to conduct, especially on the from an attacker's perspective. So it's interesting that just how much more pervasive that kind of an attack can be, right? And I think that's the interesting / nerve-wracking, but
yeah, absolutely. And I think furthermore, I think the emphasis now, like you mentioned, this has been around for a long time. I think with the emergence of IoT, and just how many devices are out there, the threat surface is just expanding so quickly as a result of that. And that's why I think that understanding those facilities and the controls on these types of devices is paramount now, because everyone knows that when something gets identified on devices that have potentially millions of systems out in the field, it's too far gone to some extent at that point, right? So I mentioned previously the various attack vectors. Something that's interesting to me is the prevalence of these low-level embedded devices, or even some more of the complicated devices that don't have strong controls against things like side channel attacks, whether it's like power analysis or fault injection or anything like that, where those attack vectors, and I'm happy to nerd out on some of that stuff. Those things are, I think, becoming more and more out of academia and more actual exploitable things, right? Like there's a ton of hardware that can help facilitate these attacks, and then can also the bar has been significantly lowered in the last 10 years or so, where and then all these I don't want to call out a specific vendor, but you have these vulnerable microchips that are in these IoT devices that are known vulnerable, and you're not gonna be able to do anything about them. So they're effectively compromised as soon as attackers realize that how easy it is to do some of these types of attacks.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Yeah, because like my background coming from the DoD was like we had to do a lot of testing and accreditation and certification around things like Tempest requirements and side channel attack. But that was a very government classified type of orientation, right? In terms of like what did they call it at the time, like EAL, like whatever that evaluated assurance levels, right? So like systems that were going to be put in like sensitive areas, like you had to get all this kind of certification around it. And now that like, hey, those kinds of attacks that were fairly theoretical or took like nation states to actually conduct, like, how often is somebody going to have the capability to do inference-based attacks on like power out, power emissions, and so it's like, yeah, very, very plausible for somebody that had unlimited time and resources, but like your average attacker wasn't going to be able to do that. And now I think you're kind of highlighting like, hey, those things are becoming more real. And if you think about like, hey, I've got a coffee pot attached to a network that is, if that's the initial vector in, and then you can start being able to use that as a pivot point. These are all things that I think the IoT and the low level attacks are becoming much more important to be aware of. I'd love to nerd out a little bit, like what are some examples of some things that you've seen or like tested against broadly speaking.
Yeah. So probably my favorite attack that hopefully people know about, and I'm by no means the premier expert on this type of attack, but correlated power analysis is by far the most exciting to me. So basically, it's this notion that you can look at the power consumption of a device, and then you can correlate the power consumption directly to memory effectively, right? So it's this idea that the number of bits that you set is directly correlated to the power consumption, right? Which makes sense at a fundamental electrical engineering level, right?
Yeah.
But what you can do, so just a simplistic example, it's like if I've got something where, it's easy for me to see ciphertext going in, and then I know that ciphertext is being decrypted. I'm guessing it's, AES 128, CTR, ECB, or whatever it is. I can collect power samples, and then I can take that ciphertext that I observed in addition to basically brute forcing an AES key, and then I can just go through and calculate what the output and what the profile or data set should look like with those AES key guesses in terms of the bits that are set and what the power profile should look like. And then instead of just brute forcing the AES key, which is obviously going to take, an inordinate amount of time, right, I can correlate those two data sets and say, this is what I'm seeing from an AES perspective. This is what the power should look like. And then I've got the actual power itself. So then when I correlate these things, it's very easy to go and reverse engineer the exact AES key that's happening, and then, compute the main AES key, and then you can compromise, that cryptography to some extent. So that's one
that's fun.
I just love, because that's the perfect convergence of my electrical engineering background directly to cybersecurity. And it's something that, I won't say that, basic IoT devices should introduce security controls to prevent against that. I think we should just know as an industry, these things are on the horizon, right? Yeah. And you should understand that is a risk in the future for sure.
Right. Yeah. Like what used to take, a team of people that had resources with a nation state or like high level, resources behind it. It took a team. Now it's like kind of in the realm of like, hey, boutique consulting firms like yourselves that have backgrounds in this and have knowledge, but don't have the resources of a government behind them, can now conduct those attacks. And then that's the natural evolution of like, hey, as we keep moving forward, there's going to be more tools and techniques to, the quote unquote script kiddies that then you don't have to have as in-depth knowledge or understanding of how to conduct it to still be able to do it. So I think that's important. And I think it's important for vendors, and product security teams of these vendors to really keep that on the horizon, because you just don't know if they're hiring folks with that level of background, right? Like it's more general security folks and whatnot, which is fine, but like just these are the kinds of things that people have to keep learning, right? So.
Yeah. And not to just mention it for the algorithm or anything, but I mean, AI is a non-zero factor in all of this as well, right? So when we start talking about correlation power analysis, or we start talking about how to do some of these things and perform robust analysis on some of this difficult to manage data at some point. I mean, I think it's only a matter of time before we start to see some of those capabilities emerge from that perspective.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I know from a hacker perspective, I loved getting to work on some of those things, because they were definitely more unique engagements, and things like that, and so I'm sure that others of our ilk in terms of like the hackers and pen testers would love to kind of have some tips and tricks. How would you tell somebody to get, where would you point them to kind of get started in product, embedded security and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's funny. I was thinking about it when you were talking about just your introduction into hacking, and kind of mine as well. When I was an embedded software developer, I used to get so upset with my manager about he would make us actually bit shift into registers on embedded devices, and it's like, hey, there's libraries for this, there's hardware abstraction layers. Why are we doing this? And I think I still feel strongly about that argument, but I don't know if he meant to do this or not. But that notion of understanding exactly the registers that I was setting, understanding how to read the data sheet effectively, and why I should enable a peripheral clock, for example. Then I got to the point where I started doing reverse engineering on bare metal microcontrollers, and I saw all of this, these addresses with these offsets, and it was bit shifting certain pieces, and it looked the same to me effectively. So I thought that was kind of funny that going through that trial led to me being a better reverse engineer. But to answer your question, I think that's exactly it. To properly secure something and provide recommendations on how to secure or how to hack it, even I think you need to understand how to build it. So one of my biggest recommendations, especially in the embedded world, is get your hands on a little discovery board, write some embedded code on it, There's all kinds of wonderful resources nowadays that really lower the bar, even from when I started not that long ago, that allow you to start writing that code on the embedded side of things, and then understand, write an embedded vulnerable application and understand how you would secure it. That, to me, that's the best way that I've learned in my time.
Yeah. No, I think that's fascinating. I mean, like, I loved reverse engineering too. And I mean, this may or may not be as relevant of a skill in the embedded software realm, but like being able to understand like how much space you might have in a very because embedded devices, they're obviously, hard limited on a lot of things, right? And like once it's out in the field, it's out in the field. Like you can't add more RAM to it, or so
Yeah, exactly.
so even if you did find a Metasploit module that might work, you had to really make sure it fit within the registers and all those things, or at least the payload. So that was what I loved about it too, because I really enjoyed reverse engineering, but it was very time consuming, right? So like,
yeah, I'd say, I mean, ARM general, most of my experience has been with ARM core microcontrollers. And I think that there's other architectures that are coming that it will be in a similar boat. But, so much of what I've seen just in the industry on reverse engineering is heavily dependent on the things that are out. So like x86, for example, for obvious reasons. So, there's really a ton of work that we can do as an industry in reverse engineering some of these low level things. Right. So, that I think it's exciting. It's exciting to know like where we're at, just because there's so much, you rip apart one device, you could have multiple different operating systems and architectures just in a single device, right? So it's always fascinating. There's a lot of work to do.
Yeah. No, that's cool. Okay, so we talked about the hackers and like kind of tips and tricks for them. What would be some advice for like the blue teamers or the product security teams that are, we alluded to it a little bit, but I'd be curious, what your advice would be for them.
Yeah, I mean, for obviously my focus is on embedded, so I'll answer it from that context. But I think the same principles apply. Introduce security as early into the product development lifecycle as you can, and you'll have better days if you find something, right? So things like threat modeling and understanding, realistic attack vectors, not just at the network and application layers, but also at the low level hardware layers. So that's a big one. I think another big sticking point for me that, people will say I talk about too often is just the idea of secure code scanning and doing effective secure code scanning. That's a very difficult thing on an embedded system, right? That's running, an RTOS or something like that, right? So having something that's actually meaningful, and identifying those different tools that are helpful to plug in, but don't just provide a ton of false positives because they're built for a different architecture or a different ecosystem. I think that's a really important thing for us as embedded developers to keep a close eye on, for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. Like the classic principles around like software development lifecycle and all those things. But also we mentioned you mentioned it before, like the supply chain. So like your SBOM and stuff like that is still really, really important, even if you don't have the skills on the reverse engineering side, but still, understanding like, hey, what libraries are you packing into an embedded system, and what could it, what are you making available to the attacker once they're in, right? Because with a larger operating system, they may have additional APIs and libraries available to them for their exploits, but on an embedded device, you might be living off different land, so to speak. So I think it is important, to emphasize like, hey, think like the attacker and try to learn their techniques. Get some exposure to reverse engineering, because like you said, like I had a lot of background in x86, not only on like assembly language coding, but also reverse engineering in an x86 architecture. But when I started doing some more embedded device, that's when I got introduced to ARM, right? And so it was like a mind meld for me. It took me some time to understand how the registers were working differently and all that. So, but understanding, I think like any true hacker, even if you're a blue teamer, like understanding how things are working under the hood only gives you more advantage to understand how it could be broken, right? So.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say too, and you kind of touched on it already, but when you have these conversations early on into a product development life cycle, right? Early on into the initial prototyping, give yourself room to be able to incorporate some of these things, right? Like, give yourself the potential for a secure element or a TPM or a trusted execution environment if you can. Or, I mean, don't lock yourself into 96% CPU utilization going into it, and then you don't have any ability to add any security at any point in time, right? So just use the information about security to give yourself the opportunity to do security, right? That's the key point there.
I think that's really good. Yeah, that's a really good point. So, well, Caleb, I mean, it's crazy how fast these sessions go, but that's why I love them. It's like, just get the nerd out and enjoy talking to really sharp people like yourself. So, yeah, I mean, thanks so much for your time. I hope people found some good takeaways. But how can people find you and what you're working on? Let us know.
Yeah. So, we are full speed with SolaSec. So you can find us on solasec.io. There's multiple fields to get in contact with us. And then we're pretty active on LinkedIn as well. So, we try to publish, blog posts and thought leadership type materials like that. So keep on the lookout for that. And then, feel free to reach out if you see me in the community, DEF CON, all those types of things. We try to stay as involved as we can.
Awesome. Well, yeah, and thanks. And I mean, obviously, we've worked with you in different capacities for many years now, so it's been fun. And but yeah, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time and expertise. I think this is a really fun topic, especially for me, because it brings back some of my day. Of what little I did, I really enjoyed it. So no, thanks a bunch. And everybody, if you have questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the chat. We'll try to get back to them as soon as we can. But other than that, we really appreciate, Caleb, your time. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for joining us on a Friday. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. We will catch you next time.